There exists in the human experience a peculiar tragedy, one that unfolds not in dramatic gestures or violent confrontations, but rather in the quiet moments between breakfast and sleep. It is the tragedy of the unlived life, the life spent in perpetual performance, the life constructed entirely from someone else's vision of what our life should be. What I'm about to share with you is the story of such a life. But more importantly, it is the story of what happened when that performance ended. My name is James Whitmore. I'm a journalist. And for the last 8 years, I've been studying the Ashford family, a fixture of Seattle's upper-class landscape. What drew me to them wasn't their wealth. In my profession, you meet the wealthy all the time. What drew me was a single question posed to me by Madison Ashford during what was supposed to be a routine interview. How many people in this world are living a complete lie? I didn't answer her that day, but I spent the next 3 years finding out. This is that story. Catherine Margaret Novak was born in 1962 in Spokane, Washington. Her father was a mill worker. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthier families on the South Hill, that particular neighborhood where the truly affluent lived behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges. Catherine's childhood could be described as constrained, not violent, not abusive in any classical sense, simply constrained, limited, a life of perpetual scarcity masquerading as normalcy, she remembers. Or so she told her therapist, years later. Lying in bed at night, listening to her parents whisper in the adjacent room, "We can't afford this. We can't afford that. There's no money." These became the refrain of her childhood. Not, "we don't have," but "we can't afford." A phrase that suggests not merely the absence of something, but the active prohibition against desiring it. By age 10, Catherine had internalized a belief system. Survival depended on wealth, and without wealth, she would dissolve into nothingness. This is important. Hold on to this, because later, much later, this belief would crystallize into something far more dangerous than mere anxiety. Now, jump forward 16 years, 1978. Catherine is a junior at Washington State University, majoring in business administration. She's attractive in a way that makes people notice her at parties. Not beautiful, but striking. There's something performative about her beauty. It's as though she's constantly auditioning for the role of beautiful woman, aware that this role came with certain advantages. It was in November of 1978 that she met Robert Foster at a fraternity mixer. Robert was from a middle-class family. His father was a contractor. He was charismatic, ambitious, and entirely unaware of the elaborate psychological architecture Catherine was constructing around him. To Robert, Catherine was simply a beautiful, intelligent woman who laughed at his jokes and seemed genuinely interested in his ambitions. What he didn't see was that Catherine was calculating. She was measuring him against a template she'd created. Financially stable, upwardly mobile, willing to prioritize wealth accumulation. Robert scored well on that rubric. They married in 1980. Madison was born in 1981. And by 1982, Robert had begun his infidelity. Not because he stopped loving Catherine, but because he'd realized that Catherine didn't actually love him. Catherine loved the stability he represented, the absence of fear, the promise of affluence. By 1984, Robert was gone. A note. A lawyer handling the details. A child support agreement that Catherine would spend the next 17 years resenting. Catherine was left, at 22, with an infant daughter and a job as an administrative assistant to a real estate agent. She was terrified. Not of being alone. Terrified of becoming her parents. Terrified that the poverty of her childhood was genetic, environmental, inevitable. This fear, this particular brand of terror, does something to a person's mind. It creates distortions, it warps decision-making, and over time, it can transform into something pathological. 30 years later, Catherine had successfully constructed a life that appeared, from the outside, to be precisely what she'd always wanted. She owned a home in a good neighborhood. She'd climbed to the position of regional manager in a commercial real estate firm. She drove a luxury sedan. She dated, never seriously, a succession of men who appreciated her style, if not her substance. By 2011, she was a woman of moderate but genuine wealth. Approximately $800,000 in liquid assets, retirement accounts, property equity. She was, by any reasonable measure, financially secure. But Catherine still woke up some mornings in a state of panic, convinced that it was all illusory, that one bad quarter, one market downturn, one moment of carelessness would strip away everything she'd built and return her to that childhood state of deprivation. She had, by this point, seen a therapist. Several, actually. None of them had quite cracked the psychological fortress she'd constructed. She was adept at appearing stable, measured, self-aware. She could discuss her childhood trauma with remarkable eloquence, but she could not quite convince herself, or her therapists, that she'd actually transcended it. It was during this period of her life, when Catherine was in her late 40s and Madison was entering young adulthood, that Catherine began to construct a new narrative, a more elaborate one. She began to tell Madison that her financial situation was more precarious than it actually was. She mentioned, in passing, that she was worried about retirement. She brought up, at dinner, a conversation with a friend whose investment advisor had failed them. She was, in essence, planting seeds, priming the narrative. And then, in the spring of 2012, when Madison was 30 years old and working as a junior manager at an upscale coffee company in Seattle, Catherine orchestrated an encounter that would set everything in motion. Madison ran into a man named Nicholas Ashford at her workplace. He was there on a Thursday morning. One of 3 visits he would make to that location, unplanned, within a single week. Coincidence, Catherine would later tell herself, is just opportunity dressed in neutral clothing. Whether the encounter was truly coincidental or whether Catherine had somehow engineered it remains, to this day, unclear. What is clear is that Catherine recognized the name Ashford with the instinctive accuracy of a dowser recognizing water. The Ashford family owned approximately 45% of the commercial real estate developed in Washington state over the preceding 50 years. They were not merely wealthy. They were an institution of wealth. What happened next unfolded with a kind of terrible inevitability. Because what we're really examining here isn't so much a premeditated crime as it is the inevitable conclusion of a psychological trajectory that had begun 3 decades earlier. Madison came home from work and mentioned, in what seemed like an offhand manner, that she'd met someone. Nicholas Ashford. He's nice, smart. He seems interested, actually. Catherine's response was immediate, almost visceral. Ashford? That Ashford? Madison found her mother's intensity unusual. She explained that she didn't know much about him, that they'd really just met. But Catherine, over the following weeks, made certain that Madison knew a great deal about the Ashford family. Not in a way that seemed obsessive. Catherine was far too skilled for that. Rather, she wove information into casual conversation. Didn't the Ashfords build that new development downtown? Someone at work was mentioning their latest project. Apparently, they're expanding into Portland. Or, I read an article in the Times about that foundation the Ashfords started. Quite impressive, apparently. These statements seemed innocent enough. They were simply facts, casually mentioned. But they served a purpose. They established, in Madison's mind, a narrative about who Nicholas Ashford was. Not simply a man she'd met, but a man whose family name carried weight, significance, economic power. It's worth noting here that Madison was not an unintelligent woman. She was actually quite perceptive. But there is a particular vulnerability in the adult child of an anxious parent, a vulnerability born from decades of absorbed worry. Madison had inherited, genetically and psychologically, her mother's anxiety about financial stability. It was this vulnerability that Catherine recognized and, whether consciously or unconsciously, exploited when Nicholas asked Madison out, which he did after the third chance encounter. Madison said yes with a mixture of genuine attraction and something more complex, a sense of rightness, as though she were moving toward her own predestined future. Over the next 18 months, their relationship deepened. Nicholas was, by all accounts, an attentive partner. He was intelligent, ambitious, and genuinely fond of Madison. He introduced her to his family. He made clear, through both action and statement, that he was interested in a future with her. But Catherine was also orchestrating a parallel narrative, a narrative that would, when Nicholas proposed, which he did in late 2013 with a 5-carat graph diamond, reach its apex. Catherine had spent the previous year constructing, with meticulous care, a financial collapse. It began with small investments that underperformed. She created documentation, official-looking statements from investment firms, some real and some fabricated, suggesting that she'd lost significant capital. She hired a lawyer friend who was, it should be noted, genuinely complicit in this deception to draft official-looking foreclosure notices against her home. She spoke to her brother, who is an accountant, and explained what she was doing. His response was disapproval mixed with resignation. "Mom, this is insane," he said. But he nonetheless provided her with documentation that appeared to show significant losses in a Ponzi scheme investment. Catherine then made certain that she appeared to be in financial crisis. She rented a small apartment in a lower-income neighborhood of Seattle. She returned her luxury vehicle and purchased a used Honda Civic. She began buying her clothing from thrift stores. The transformation was remarkable. She moved with the careful deliberation of a woman performing poverty. But the performance was so meticulous, so thoroughly executed, that it became nearly indistinguishable from the reality of poverty itself. and then she invited Madison over. When Madison walked into that spare apartment, saw the mattress on the floor, the card table serving as a desk, the conspicuous absence of anything suggesting comfort or security, she experienced what can only be described as a psychological rupture. Her mother, the woman who had always seemed, in some ineffable way, secure, was revealed to be not merely vulnerable, but devastated. "Oh my God, Mom," Madison said, standing in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. "What happened?" Catherine, who had rehearsed this moment extensively in her mind, delivered her performance with absolute conviction. "Sit down, honey. I need to tell you something." And then she did. She told Madison about the failed investments. She showed her the mostly fabricated documentation. She wept. Genuinely, actually wept. Because by this point, the distinction between the performance and her authentic emotion had become hopelessly blurred. "I didn't want to tell you before the wedding," Catherine said. "I didn't want to burden you with this. But I need to be honest. I'm going to lose this apartment. My retirement is gone. I've lost everything." Madison held her mother, and in that moment, she made a decision that would echo through the next decade of her life. "It's okay, Mom. We'll figure this out. You're not alone." That evening, Madison called Nicholas, and she explained, with obvious distress, that her mother had experienced financial catastrophe and was facing homelessness. Nicholas's response was the response of a decent man. "Of course we'll help her," he said. "Don't worry. We'll take care of it." Within 48 hours, Nicholas had settled Catherine's fabricated debts, purchased her a smaller but comfortable home, and established a trust fund that would provide her with $200,000 annually for the rest of her life. Catherine Foster had successfully engineered a permanent income stream based on a fiction. It was, in a certain sense, the culmination of a psychological project that had begun in her childhood and had evolved, over 30 years, into something approaching pathology. What Catherine did not know, what she could not have predicted, was that her carefully constructed deception had already been discovered, and that the person who discovered it had no intention of telling her, not yet, of his discovery. Nicholas Ashford was not a naive man. He had built a billion-dollar real estate empire not through inheritance alone, but through an almost obsessive attention to detail. He was the type of person who read contracts entirely before signing them, who researched business associates exhaustively, who trusted his intuition, which was almost always accurate. From the moment Catherine claimed financial devastation, something in Nicholas's mind registered as discordant. It wasn't anything Catherine said, specifically. It was the mathematical improbability of it. Catherine had been a successful real estate executive for 20 years. She'd invested wisely. She'd earned $200,000 plus annually for the better part of 2 decades. The notion that she'd somehow lost everything simultaneously seemed, to Nicholas's rigorously analytical mind, statistically improbable. So he did what he rarely did anymore. He hired a private investigator. Not to humiliate Catherine, but because his instinct was demanding answers. The investigator was efficient. Within 3 weeks, he'd compiled a comprehensive dossier. Catherine's financial statements were stable. Her actual portfolio showed conservative, steady growth. There was no hidden bankruptcy. There was no secret debt. There was only a woman who claimed to be devastated while remaining, in every quantifiable way, financially secure. This discovery troubled Nicholas in ways that a simple financial fraud would not have. Financial crimes, in his experience, were common enough in the business world. What troubled him was the betrayal it suggested, the violation of Madison's trust, the manipulation of his own generosity. He authorized the investigator to continue, to examine Catherine's apartment, to see if there was any evidence explaining the discrepancy between her claim of poverty and the reality of her financial situation. The investigator found the diary in what was arguably the most obvious hiding place Catherine could have chosen, beneath the mattress on her bedroom floor. The diary was a leather-bound journal. Catherine had written in it, almost daily, for the previous 6 months. The handwriting was careful, precise, sometimes ecstatic, sometimes guilt-ridden, but always unfailingly candid. Nicholas read the entries in his office on a Thursday afternoon. Here's what he found. March 15th. Told Madison today about the foreclosure. The lie came out so smoothly. It's strange. The more I say it, the more real it feels. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. April 2nd. Nicholas paid off all of the fake debts today. $340,000. I was right. He couldn't say no. Catherine Foster is now officially a permanent dependent of the Ashford family. The plan worked. April 20th. Feeling guilty today. Madison seemed so worried about me. Is it wrong to lie to your own daughter to secure your future? I keep telling myself it was necessary, that I was protecting myself. But I think I'm protecting something else. I'm protecting the child inside me who was always terrified. June 1st. Nicholas mentioned something odd today. He asked Madison if I'd always been financially irresponsible. Madison said no, so he suspects nothing. Yet, June 15th. I bought something nice today. A silk scarf from that boutique in Belltown. For a moment, I felt like I'd been caught. Like Nicholas would somehow know that someone who was truly impoverished couldn't afford a $200 scarf. But then I realized, that's what the lie is for. To provide the permission I need to actually enjoy my life. There were dozens of entries, some showing remorse, most showing justification, all showing, in exquisite detail, the psychological gymnastics Catherine had performed to transform a calculated deception into something approaching moral acceptability. Nicholas finished reading at 10 p.m. He sat in his office for another 3 hours, moving through a series of emotional states that no single word could adequately capture. Anger, certainly. Disappointment, obviously. But also, in some strange register, a kind of sadness. Because Nicholas understood, perhaps better than most people, what Catherine was running from. He'd known several wealthy individuals whose anxiety about money bordered on the pathological. He understood that Catherine's deception, while reprehensible, was ultimately symptomatic of a deeper wound. It was, however, still a betrayal. He had 2 days until he was supposed to marry Madison. He considered his options with the precision that had characterized his professional life. Option 1. Cancel the wedding. Tell Madison everything. Allow her to experience the devastation of discovering her mother's deception. Option 2. Proceed with the marriage and maintain the secret. Let it fester between them. Let it slowly poison the relationship from within. Option 3. Marry Madison. eventually tell her the truth, but in a way that also provided her with an opportunity for genuine growth. An opportunity to see that deception, when exposed, creates space for something far more valuable than the lie ever could provide. Option 3 was the one that appealed to Nicholas. Not because it was kind to Catherine, it wasn't, but because it was, in the final analysis, the most honest course available to him. He called his father Benjamin Ashford, a man of 84 who had built the family fortune and who had, over the years, accumulated a kind of practical wisdom that transcended mere business acumen. "Dad, I need to tell you something," Nicholas said, and he proceeded to explain everything. His father listened without interrupting. When Nicholas finished, Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Have you told her?" "No." "Are you going to?" "I don't know yet." "Then let me ask you this. Do you love Madison?" "Yes." "Genuinely? Not just because she's beautiful or because the relationship is convenient?" "Genuinely." "Then you have your answer," Benjamin said. "You marry her. You keep this secret. But you keep it with the intention of eventually telling her. And when you do it in a way that forces her to choose. Remain complicit in the lie, or become honest. Most people, when given the choice clearly, will choose honesty, even when it costs them." "That's a lot to assume," Nicholas said. "Yes, but you're not assuming it. You're betting on it. And I think you're right to bet." Nicholas married Madison the following Saturday. For 3 years, Nicholas and Madison lived what appeared to be an ideal marriage. They had a daughter, Sophie, born in March of 2014. They renovated a historic home in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. They traveled extensively. They attended charity functions and fundraisers. They were, by all outward measures, happy. But Nicholas carried the knowledge of Catherine's deception like a stone in his chest. It didn't weigh on him constantly. There were days, many days, when he could forget entirely. But in moments of intimacy with Madison, when she spoke of how grateful she was for his help with her mother, the stone would shift, and he would feel, acutely, the weight of the lie between them. During this time, Catherine lived her fabricated poverty with increasing elaborateness. She spent money, but always in ways that seemed consistent with her supposedly limited means. She purchased a modest wardrobe. She attended free cultural events. She volunteered at a community center, allowing people to believe that she volunteered out of necessity rather than genuine altruism. She was, in every sense, a method actor who had become so absorbed in her role that the distinction between character and self had vanished. Madison, meanwhile, was evolving in ways that Catherine had not anticipated. Motherhood had changed her. More specifically, being a mother in a state of financial security. Something Catherine had never experienced was allowing Madison to develop a psychological resilience that her mother lacked. One day, when Sophie was 3 years old, Catherine was babysitting. Madison was working on a project with Nicholas, and Catherine, in a moment of unguarded vulnerability, said to her granddaughter, "Your mommy is so lucky, Sophie. She married someone rich. That's the best thing a woman can do." Sophie, who was 3 years old and therefore incapable of understanding the implications of what her grandmother was saying, simply nodded and returned to her coloring. But Madison, who had walked back into the room precisely in time to hear this statement, froze. Later that night, she asked Nicholas, "Do you think my mom believes that? That I'm lucky because you're wealthy?" Nicholas considered his response carefully. "I think your mother has complicated relationships with money." "Yes." "Did she tell you that's why she wanted us to get together?" Nicholas paused. This was the precipice. This was the moment where he could either continue the deception or begin the process of honest reckoning. "Madison, I need to tell you something. And I need you to prepare yourself for the fact that it will be difficult to hear." What followed was Nicholas's recitation of what he'd learned from the investigator. The diary entries, the fabricated debts, the calculated manipulation, all of it. Madison's response was not immediate. She listened without interrupting. She read the diary entries. Nicholas had kept the originals, locked in a safe, and when she finished, she simply sat in the silence of their bedroom, unable to move. "How long have you known?" she finally asked. "Since before we were married." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to make sure you were strong enough to handle it, and because I wanted to see what would happen if I did tell you. I wanted to know if you would choose complicity or honesty." Madison stood up. She left the bedroom. She went into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water that she didn't drink. She looked out at the Seattle skyline from their floor-to-ceiling windows, and she made a decision that would, in many ways, define the rest of her life. She called her mother. "Mom, I need you to come over. Right now. And I need you to bring something with you." "What do I need to bring?" "I think you know what you need to bring." When Catherine arrived, 20 minutes later, she was already pale. She'd understood, in the way that liars often can, that the game was over. "Your diary?" Madison asked. Catherine said nothing, but she reached into her purse and withdrew the leather-bound journal. For the next 6 hours, Madison and Catherine sat at the kitchen table, and Madison asked questions. Not angry questions, not accusatory questions, simply honest questions. Why did you do this? When did you know it was wrong? What were you afraid of? Did you ever stop believing your own lie? Catherine answered each question with a degree of honesty that surprised them both. And by the end of those 6 hours, a strange thing had happened. Catherine had experienced something approaching genuine confession. Not performed contrition, not manipulative remorse, but actual, authentic acceptance of what she'd done and why. "I think I need help," Catherine finally said. "Real help. Professional help." "I think so too," Madison said. "But here's the deal. If you're going to get help, it can't just be for you. It has to be so you can genuinely change, so you can learn to be honest, especially with me. I can do that. I don't know if you can, but I'm willing to find out." 3 days later, Catherine began weekly sessions with a therapist who specialized in trauma and deceptive behavior. And it was during one of these sessions, approximately 2 months into therapy, that Madison and Nicholas made a proposal to Catherine that would set in motion the events that would eventually transform all of their lives. The Ashford family had, for the past 15 years, hosted an annual engagement celebration. It was a significant event in Seattle society, not quite as formal as the wedding itself, but a curated gathering of the family's closest friends, colleagues, and associates. 200 people, typically, an exclusive venue. the kind of affair that the society pages would cover. It was Nicholas who first suggested the idea to Catherine. They were sitting in his office, a space Catherine had never been comfortable in because it represented the power differential between them so starkly. "I want you to do something for me," Nicholas said. "Something that terrifies you, I imagine." "What?" "I want you to stand up in front of the guests at the engagement celebration for Madison's cousin, and I want you to tell them the truth. I want you to tell them what you did, why you did it, and what you've learned in the process." Catherine's face went white. "Nicholas, you can't possibly be serious." "I'm entirely serious, and here's why. You told Madison that you wanted to change, genuine change, the kind that actually transforms someone, requires more than private confession. It requires public accountability. It requires choosing honesty, even when honesty is humiliating." "That's not fair," Catherine said. "I've been doing the work. I've been showing up to therapy." "Yes, you have, and that's admirable. But you've also been living a half-truth. Everyone around you, your friends, your colleagues, your family, everyone still believes the lie about your financial situation. So you're not actually living an honest life. You're living a partially honest life. That's not redemption. That's just exhaustion." Catherine wanted to refuse. Everything in her rebelled against the idea. But she'd also made a commitment, not just to Nicholas and Madison, but to herself, to seek genuine change. And she recognized, with the part of her that was finally developing actual self-awareness, that Nicholas was right. "If I do this," Catherine said slowly, "will you promise me something?" "What?" "That you'll actually forgive me, not just tolerate me, not just accept my transformation, but actually forgive me." Nicholas considered this. "I already have," he said finally. "I forgave you the day I finished reading your diary, because I realized that what you'd done to me was far less destructive than what you'd done to yourself. And if you've done the work to forgive yourself, then my forgiveness is simply a formality." Catherine began preparing her confession approximately 3 weeks before the engagement celebration. She wrote it out, word for word. She practiced it. She showed drafts to her therapist, who helped her refine it so that it was honest without being self-flagellating, accountable without being self-destructive. Madison spent time with her mother during this period. It was, in many ways, the first truly honest time they'd shared in years. Madison asked her mother about her childhood, about her father, about the specific moments when fear had calcified into deception. And Catherine answered with a degree of vulnerability that she'd never previously permitted herself. "I think I was a coward," Catherine said one afternoon. They were having tea in Catherine's small apartment. "I think I've always been a coward, and I used money, or the idea of money, as a shield against my cowardice." "You're not a coward," Madison said. "A coward wouldn't have the strength to admit what you've admitted." "Then what am I?" "You're someone who's learning. That's all any of us can be." The evening of the engagement celebration arrived. It was October, and the venue, a historic ballroom in downtown Seattle, had been decorated with autumn florals and candlelight. The guest list included some of the most prominent figures in the Pacific Northwest: business executives, philanthropists, politicians, celebrities. It was, in many respects, the ideal audience for Catherine's confession, because it would be people of power, people accustomed to admiring the successful and dismissing the failed. And if Catherine could find acceptance among such an audience, perhaps she could begin to believe in her own redemption. Nicholas stood at the podium approximately 1 hour into the evening. He'd given his planned remarks, warm, affectionate words about Madison, witty observations about his cousin, the obligatory toast that moved the room in subtle ways. And then he said something that deviated from the prepared script. But before we continue the celebration, I'd like to invite someone to the podium, someone whose presence here tonight has been hard-won. Catherine Foster, would you please come up? There was a moment of confusion. Catherine hadn't been announced. No one knew she was going to speak. For a second, she didn't move. She simply sat, gripping the edge of her table, unable to convince her body to comply with what her mind had already decided to do. Madison reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. "You can do this, Mom," she whispered, "and I'll be here the whole time." Catherine stood on shaking legs. She walked through 200 curious stairs. She climbed the 3 steps to the podium, and she looked out at a room full of people who thought they knew exactly who she was. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that the audience had to strain to hear her. This was intentional. It forced a kind of attentiveness, a kind of respect for the difficulty of what she was about to do. "My name is Catherine Foster. Most of you don't know me. Some of you may know of me. I'm Madison's mother. I'm Sophie's grandmother. And I need to tell you something that I've been rehearsing, in private, for weeks. I lied. For years, I lied. And I lied not because circumstances forced me to lie, but because I chose to lie. Because I was afraid. 3 years ago, I told my daughter that I'd lost my entire fortune, that I was going to become homeless, that I needed financial help. All of it was fabricated. I created fake debt, fake lawsuits, fake investment failures. And I did this deliberately, with intention, to manipulate my future son-in-law into giving me money. The room was absolutely silent. No one was drinking. No one was moving. The only sound was Catherine's voice, steady now, though slightly trembling. I did this because my childhood was marked by poverty. Not the poverty of actual deprivation, but the poverty of fear. My parents were always afraid of losing what little they had. And I internalized that fear so completely that I made it the organizing principle of my life. I became a successful businesswoman. I accumulated wealth. And yet the fear never left. It just waited. It watched. And when I saw an opportunity to secure myself permanently, when I saw a way to ensure that I would never be vulnerable, I took it. I didn't think of it as lying. I thought of it as strategic honesty. I told myself that my deception was a small price to pay for my peace of mind. What I didn't anticipate was that the lie would eventually demand more than I was willing to pay. My son-in-law discovered the truth. Instead of abandoning me, he did something extraordinary. He insisted on accountability. He insisted that I face what I'd done. Not privately, in therapy, where I could control the narrative, but publicly. In front of people who might judge me, might dismiss me, might see me clearly as someone who had committed a betrayal. And I want to tell you why I'm here, telling you this, despite every instinct I have screaming at me to run. I'm here because my daughter has shown me that honesty, even brutally honest, humiliating honesty, is more powerful than any lie I could construct. I'm here because I realized that the only real security in this world is the security of being known completely and accepted anyway. I'm here because I'm trying to be better. Not perfect, not redeemed in any complete sense, but genuinely, incrementally, trying to be a version of myself that is honest. To Madison, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for teaching you that love was conditional on financial stability. I'm sorry for showing you that manipulation was an acceptable strategy for getting what you needed. I'm sorry for the years of dishonesty. To Nicholas, I'm sorry for violating your generosity, for treating your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. And I'm grateful, beyond the capacity of words, that you chose accountability over abandonment. To Sophie, my granddaughter, who's too young to understand any of this, I'm sorry in advance for the ways that my failures will inevitably shape you. And I promise you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be someone you can trust completely. And to everyone here, I hope that my confession serves as something more than entertainment. I hope it serves as a reminder that the people you admire most might be carrying secrets, that the people you judge most harshly might be doing their best with the psychological tools they have. And that redemption, genuine redemption, requires not just the desire to change, but the willingness to change publicly, to be held accountable, to choose honesty even when it's devastating. I don't know if you will forgive me. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness, but I know that I deserve accountability, and I'm choosing to accept it. Catherine stepped back from the podium, and in that moment, something extraordinary happened. A woman in the fifth row stood up. She was Margaret Liu, a well-known philanthropist and venture capitalist. She began to clap, not mockingly, genuinely. And then, slowly, others joined. Not the entire room. There were people who remained seated, their faces unreadable, but enough. Enough to transform the moment from humiliation to something far more complex, recognition of courage. What happened after the engagement celebration surprised Catherine. The social consequences she'd feared, ostracism, ridicule, the loss of friendships, never materialized. Or rather, they materialized selectively. Some friendships did end. Several people who had been connected to Catherine distanced themselves. There was a certain type of person, she realized, who required the illusion of other people's stability in order to maintain their own. When Catherine shattered that illusion, they had no choice but to disappear. But something far more substantial emerged to replace those friendships. Margaret Liu, the philanthropist who'd initiated the applause, approached Catherine at the bar later that evening. She was a woman in her 60s, elegant, formidable in a way that suggested she'd spent her life making difficult decisions. "What you did tonight," Margaret said, "was braver than anything I've done in my career, and I've spent 30 years making strategic decisions that affected millions of dollars." "I'm not sure how to respond to that," Catherine said. "You don't need to respond. You just need to understand that there's a particular power in public confession. It changes people, not just the confessor, everyone who witnesses it." Over the following months, Catherine found herself transformed by her own confession in ways she couldn't have predicted. Margaret Liu became a mentor. She introduced Catherine to other people who had experienced similar patterns of trauma and deception. She helped Catherine develop a speaking practice, initially for small groups, then for larger audiences. Catherine began to speak at universities, at corporate wellness conferences, at therapy training programs. Each time, she told her story in slightly different ways, but always with the same core truth, that the lie we tell to protect ourselves often damages others far more than honesty would have. Approximately 1 year after the engagement celebration, Catherine was invited to discuss her experience on a podcast that focused on psychological topics. The episode went viral. People who'd struggled with similar patterns of deception recognized themselves in Catherine's story. Within 6 months, Catherine had published a memoir entitled The Cost of the Lie: How I Learned That Honesty is the Only Currency That Matters. It was not a bestseller in the commercial sense, but it became required reading in certain therapeutic communities. Psychology departments used it as a teaching text. But more importantly, Catherine's confession created space for other people to begin to confess as well. The engagement celebration footage eventually made its way online, and hundreds of people, maybe thousands, shared their own stories of deception in the comments section. What Catherine had initiated was a kind of cultural permission structure. She had shown that a public confession, delivered with genuine accountability and without self-flagellation, could create rather than destroy. Madison, meanwhile, experienced her own transformation. The discovery of her mother's deception had initially fractured her understanding of reality, but it had also, paradoxically, freed her. She realized that the security she'd attributed to her mother's presence in her life had been illusory all along, which meant that she was more capable, more resilient than she'd ever believed. She began to work with Nicholas on his philanthropic foundation. Together, they developed programs focused on financial literacy for families who'd experienced poverty trauma. They created therapeutic initiatives designed to help people understand the psychological consequences of financial anxiety. And they made a particular point to focus on families where intergenerational poverty trauma was creating destructive patterns. They weren't trying to fix Catherine's problem. Rather, they were trying to prevent Catherine's problem from being transmitted to the next generation. Sophie, Catherine's granddaughter, grew up in a household where honesty was not merely valued but actively practiced. When she asked difficult questions, her parents, Madison and Nicholas, answered them honestly. When they made mistakes, they acknowledged them openly. She was not raised to fear poverty, but rather to understand wealth as a tool, not a solution. As for Nicholas, he found that his decision to maintain the secret and then reveal it at a calculated moment had deepened his understanding of his own values. He'd believed that honesty was paramount, but the engagement celebration had taught him something more nuanced, that honesty, when wielded without compassion, is merely cruelty, and that redemption requires not just accountability, but also recognition of the humanity in the person being held accountable. 5 years after the engagement celebration, Catherine was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She was 58 years old. She received the diagnosis with remarkable equanimity. During her final months, She was visited by hundreds of people, friends, former colleagues, people who'd read her book and felt seen by her story. She held court from her hospital bed, continuing to speak, continuing to mentor, continuing to model what genuine transformation looked like. 3 weeks before her death, Madison asked her mother if she had any regrets. "One regret," Catherine said. "Not that I lied. Not that I was forced to confess publicly. My one regret is that I wasted so many years being afraid." If I could speak to my younger self, I would tell her, fear is not your enemy. Your fear is information. It's telling you what you need to heal. And the only way to heal is to stop running from the fear and instead turn toward it. Look at it. Understand it. And eventually transcend it. Catherine died on a Tuesday morning in March. Madison was there, holding her hand. Sophie was there as well, though she stepped out of the room before the end, unable to witness the moment of transition. At Catherine's memorial service, more than 1,000 people attended. The guest list was remarkable in its diversity. Business executives sitting next to therapists, celebrities next to social workers, family members next to people she'd helped through her foundation. Nicholas gave the eulogy. He spoke, not about Catherine's successes, but about her willingness to fail publicly and be redeemed through that failure. He spoke about the courage it takes to say, in front of witnesses, "I was wrong, and I'm trying to be better." And then he said something that seemed to encapsulate everything Catherine had become in her final years. Catherine Foster was not a perfect woman. She made terrible mistakes. She lied when she should have been honest. She manipulated when she should have asked for help. But in her final years, she became something rare. She became real. And in becoming real, she became remarkable. Catherine Foster taught us that redemption is not a destination. It's not something you achieve and then rest. It's a practice. It's something you do every day, every moment, by choosing honesty over comfort, by choosing accountability over excuse-making, by choosing to be known over chosen to be admired. She did not do this perfectly. She stumbled. She had moments of regression, but she kept returning to that commitment. And in doing so, she became, perhaps without intending it, a model for what it looks like to live with integrity. The Ashford family established, in Catherine's name, the Catherine Foster Institute for the Study of Intergenerational Trauma. It's housed at the University of Washington and has become a leading center for research into how poverty trauma is transmitted across generations and how therapeutic intervention can interrupt that transmission. Madison serves on the board of directors. She's also a licensed counselor, specializing in working with people from low-income backgrounds who've experienced the kind of psychological distortion that Catherine experienced. Sophie, who is now 30 years old, works as a therapist in Seattle. She specializes in family trauma and has dedicated her practice to serving low-income communities. She's published research on the long-term psychological consequences of intergenerational financial anxiety. None of this erases Catherine's lies. None of this makes the manipulation she committed acceptable or forgivable in any absolute sense. But it suggests something important, that our worst moments do not define us entirely, that confession and accountability can create space for genuine transformation, and that sometimes the most valuable thing a person can teach others is what they've learned from failing. I began this story by asking a question. How many people in this world are living a complete lie? The answer, based on psychological research and my own observations, is likely most of us, to varying degrees. In varying ways, we construct narratives about ourselves that we present to the world. We emphasize certain truths while hiding others. We perform versions of ourselves that we believe will be accepted, admired, loved. This is not, in itself, pathological. To some degree, the ability to curate our self-presentation is necessary for social functioning. We do this constantly. We're one version of ourselves with our parents, another with our intimate partners, another with our colleagues. But there is a threshold, and Catherine Foster crossed it, where the performance becomes so consuming that the performer loses themselves entirely, where the lie doesn't serve a function, where it becomes an end in itself. What made Catherine's story remarkable was not the lie, but her willingness to stop lying, not just in private, but publicly, not just for personal redemption, but as a gift to others. I want to offer you 3 lessons from Catherine's story. First, acknowledge your relationship with fear. Catherine's fundamental problem was not that she was dishonest. It was that she was terrified, and she chose deception as a way of managing that terror. But deception never actually manages terror. It only postpones it. It transforms it into something larger, more complex, more toxic. If you're tempted to lie about your financial situation, your background, your history, your present circumstances, pause and ask yourself, what am I afraid of? Name the fear. Don't try to fix it immediately. Just acknowledge it. Often, the act of simply naming the fear diminishes its power over you. Second, understand that accountability is not punishment. When Nicholas required Catherine to confess publicly, Catherine experienced it as punishment, and there's no question that it was painful. But it wasn't punishment in the sense of being harmful or destructive. It was accountability in the sense of being held responsible for your actions and being required to make amends. This distinction is crucial. Punishment is something done to you by someone else. Accountability is something you choose to accept. When Catherine volunteered to confess, when she chose to face the people she'd deceived, she transformed what could have been punishment into redemption. If you've done something wrong, if you've lied or manipulated or deceived someone, don't wait for external punishment to teach you the lesson. Choose accountability. Choose to face the person you've harmed. Choose to acknowledge, directly and without excuse, what you've done and why. This is harder than any punishment could ever be. And precisely because it's harder, it's more transformative. Third, recognize that redemption requires sustained effort. Catherine didn't confess once and become redeemed. She spent 10 years, every single day, choosing honesty over comfort. She went to therapy. She did the work. She failed sometimes and had to start again. Redemption is not a moment. It's a practice. It's something you do, not something you achieve. If you're struggling with patterns of deception in your own life, if you're constructing narratives that don't serve you or the people you love, begin the work of transformation today. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. Speak one truth you've been avoiding. Acknowledge one fear you've been hiding. Make one amend for one lie you've told. And then tomorrow, do it again. And the day after. And the day after that. This is the work of becoming human. The real human. Not the performed human. Not the curated human. But the actual, vulnerable, imperfect human. Catherine Foster was not extraordinary in any conventional sense. She was not particularly intelligent or talented or beautiful. She was simply a woman who, at a certain point in her life, made a decision to stop running and start facing. And in doing so, she became something remarkable. She became honest. My name is James Whitmore. I've been your narrator this evening, and I want to thank you for listening to Catherine's story. Not for entertainment, though I hope it was engaging, but because her story is also your story. It's the story of what we all face, in one form or another, when we're forced to choose between the comfort of the lie and the difficulty of the truth. I believe, based on everything I've learned, that honesty is always the right choice, even when it's devastating, even when it costs everything, even when there's no guarantee that it will be accepted or forgiven. Honesty is the only currency that actually has value. Thank you for listening.